All right, let's dive into the presidency of Bill Clinton. His time in the White House, from 1993 to 2001, was this incredible mix of massive economic success and, at the same time, some really deep political turmoil. It's a story full of contradictions, and we're going to unpack it all.
And that brings us to the big question, right? When you look back, what really defines the Clinton years? Is it the incredible success story, or is it the scandals that seem to follow him? Honestly, historians are still arguing about it, and today we're going to look at both sides. So let's start from the top.
Okay, first things first. You gotta understand the context. Bill Clinton was the very first baby boomer president, the first one born after World War II. This was a huge generational shift, and he stepped onto the scene right as the Cold War was ending. The whole world was changing.
And his campaign message? Man, it really resonated with people. Remember, the U.S. was shaking off a recession, and Clinton's promise was pretty straightforward. He was going to focus on the economy, on modernizing it, and really zero in on the needs of regular, everyday American families.
And that focus on the economy, well, it leads us straight into the first and maybe biggest pillar of his presidency, an economic boom that was honestly unlike almost anything the country had seen before. It really defined the 1990s.
So you might be asking how they pull it off. Well, right out of the gate, the administration pushed for a new budget plan to attack the huge national deficit. That's the gap between what the government spends and what it brings in. The plan had two main parts: cut spending, especially on defense now that the Cold War was over, and also raise taxes on the highest incomes. The idea was to build confidence back in the economy.
And the results? They were just staggering. Over his 2 terms, the U.S. economy created more than 22 million new jobs. Think about that for a second. That's the most jobs ever created under a single administration. It was just this period of powerful, sustained growth.
And all that job growth, it wasn't just a number on a page. It had a huge real-world impact. By the end of the 90s, the unemployment rate had dropped to historic lows, even dipping below 4%. This meant the economy wasn't just growing for Wall Street. It was creating real opportunities for millions of people.
This chart right here shows the incredible turnaround on the financial side. I mean, for decades, the government had been spending more than it made. It was deep in the red. But that budget plan, plus a booming tech sector that sent tax revenues soaring, actually worked. The deficit just kept shrinking, and by 1998, the government was running a budget surplus. It was taking in more money than it spent, for the first time in generations.
Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Not every economic policy was a home run with everybody. Clinton was a big champion of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Supporters were convinced it would kickstart economic growth by creating this giant free trade zone with Canada and Mexico. But on the other side, critics were really worried it would just send American manufacturing jobs south of the border. It's still a super controversial part of his legacy today.
Now, let's shift gears a bit, because beyond the economy, the whole world was changing. The Cold War was over, the old rules were gone, and America had to figure out its new role. Clinton's foreign policy was all about navigating this new era of globalization and trying to promote democracy.
And his administration was really active on the world stage. They expanded the NATO alliance into Eastern Europe, trying to bring stability to former Soviet countries. They used American influence to help broker the Dayton Peace Accords, which finally ended that brutal war in Bosnia. And they also put a lot of energy into facilitating historic peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians.
But, this new world wasn't all about making peace deals. It also came with new kinds of threats. When U.S. targets were hit by terrorist attacks, the administration responded with military strikes, and they kept tough economic sanctions on Iraq, which was still seen as a major source of instability in the Middle East.
Okay, now for the other side of the coin. Because even while the economy was booming and America was active abroad, back home in Washington, D.C., well, it was a different story. The Clinton years were defined by some really fierce, really bitter political battles.
One of Clinton's biggest ambitions, right from the start, was healthcare reform. He wanted to create a national health insurance system. This was a massive goal, but the plan ran into a brick wall of political opposition, and in the end, it failed to pass Congress. It was a huge legislative defeat for him.
And the political fights, they just got more intense from there. Clashes with the Republican-controlled Congress over the federal budget got so bad that they led to 2 separate government shutdowns in '95 and '96. Federal services were temporarily shut down, really highlighting just how deep and bitter the partisan divide had become.
But even those high-stakes political fights were about to get completely overshadowed by a personal scandal that would totally consume Washington and would lead to only the second presidential impeachment in all of U.S. history.
So, what was this all about? The whole controversy was centered on President Clinton's relationship with a White House intern. A legal investigation into it led to these very serious formal accusations that he had committed perjury, which, in simple terms, is lying under oath, and that he had obstructed justice to try and cover it all up. Now, the whole constitutional process here can seem kind of complicated, so let's just break it down. First, you have the accusations. Those led the House of Representatives to vote to impeach him on 2 counts, one for perjury, one for obstruction of justice. Now, impeachment is basically like a formal indictment. It doesn't remove a president from office. For that, the process moves to the Senate for a full trial. And at the end of that trial, he was acquitted on both charges, which meant he stayed in office. So when you put it all together, the soaring historic economy on one hand, and this incredibly damaging historic scandal on the other, what you're left with is a super complicated legacy. I mean, how do you even begin to reconcile these two completely different stories? And you can really see the two sides of the coin laid out right here. In one column, you have these undeniable accomplishments, incredible job growth, those budget surpluses we talked about, and some really important peace agreements. But in the other column, you have the major controversies, that big failure on healthcare reform, and of course, the impeachment scandal that completely dominated his second term.
And all of this leaves us with one final big question. When a president's time in office has such incredible highs, but also such profound lows, how do we weigh one against the other? How should history ultimately judge a leader with so many stark contrasts? It's a question that pretty much guarantees we'll be debating Bill Clinton's legacy for a long, long time.